Welcome back to Lost in Games Unscripted, the semi-regular, kind of more regular series on the channel where I talk about whatever happens to be on my mind at a given time. This is I've been talking a lot lately about like stories and games and that kind of thing and rewriting things. But if I don't hit the microphone too much, I wanted to try and branch out a little bit with the series and talk about some different stuff, because what I've been talking about is fun, but I can only talk about like writing in games and how to correct that writing so often before it gets boring, and I want to move on and talk about other things. We'll keep on games for the most part, but there will be times that I will, branch off into things like TV shows and movies and that kind of thing moving forward in the future. I've got some other ideas for this series as well for some different areas that I'm going to record in. So stay tuned for all of that. But today we're talking about games in general, but more kind of a question that's been on my mind for a while is, what is the best decade in gaming? It sounds really like an odd thing, but my brain works really weird sometimes with some of these things. And I've seen people talk in the past about why this decade or that decade, or why this game or this year or that year is better for gaming. And it's always been one of those things that has intrigued me, because there's no real good way to put a good, like, you can't sit back and say, well, this is the best decade because of all of these reasons. Like, there's no, it's all arbitrary, right? There's no objective measure to talk about what is the best decade in gaming. You could talk about game sales, you could talk about the types of games, you could talk about the stories, you could talk about, there's a million things you could talk about if you wanted to quantify things from a specific standpoint. But in general, if you just ask the question, what is the best decade in gaming? Is there really an answer to that question? Games have been around for a while now. The first video games, technically, I think were like in the 1950s and 60s, technically, because the things like Pong and stuff, like some of the earliest stuff. But gaming didn't really start taking off until the 70s and 80s. And a lot of that was arcades. You would go down to the arcade, you would pop a quarter in, and you would play, I don't know, Mortal Kombat maybe. Some of the games that got behind me, Pac-Man. But eventually it grew into like the home console systems. You had the Sega and the NES and the Nintendo. I was going to say Nintendo, I already said NES, but you had the home consoles, and then you had computers, right? So it's kind of like spun off from there. And then you get to the point where you eventually have like online type of gaming, which brings us back around to the arcades, except not in person, I guess. Arcades, you could go and you could play games. Some of them were multiplayer, some of them were single player. People would stand around and watch you play. Very similar in some ways. It was kind of like the predecessor, the 80s version of what you think of Twitch streams, YouTube streams, that kind of thing. And then nowadays you've got online gaming, and it's not just where people are streaming games, but where you're playing games together with your friends. And instead of putting a quarter in the slot to play the game, you're paying, 10, 15, 20 bucks a month or whatever for a subscription, or you're buying loot crates or whatever, that kind of thing. So it's kind of taken on a life. It's kind of changed a lot over time. And so what I really want to talk about and try to dig into, I want to look at my history in games and stuff that I've played, and think back on some of the aspects of different generations, and then talk a little bit about what exactly we would be wanting, what we should be looking at when it comes to games, because there's differences obviously in graphics. Storytelling in games, I don't think has really progressed a ton. Some of the earlier games obviously didn't have like really deep, rich stories. Pac-Man, for instance, doesn't have like a deep, rich story necessarily. It has some underlying stuff, but there were games even in the 80s that were kind of story-based games, and you had things like Metal Gear Solid was one of the really early ones that comes to mind right off the top of my head. But games like that had stories, and while it may seem a little bit more complex nowadays, there were text-based games like Zork that very heavy on the story if you really get into it, right? It was, you think of Dungeons and Dragons, but on a computer type of situation. Elder Scrolls games in the 90s were some of the first really big story-heavy RPGs. So is it story? Is it graphics? Is it what exactly is it? I think I have an answer, but I'll wait till the end of the video to really get into that answer. So I want to start with talking about my history in games. I've got some notes here so I don't forget anything. But in the 90s, for instance, I played games like in the Doom series. I played Spyro the Dragon, Gran Turismo. I had a PlayStation. We had a PC in the early 90s, and I played Doom, Duke Nukem. We played Wacky Wheels. I've talked about all of those before. And to me, the heart of the 90s, the thing that really sticks out to me from a gaming perspective was sitting down and playing games with my brothers. And we would be taking turns on things like Metal Gear Solid, where I would, we each only had a set amount of time. My mom was kind of strict when it came to games. So we had like 30 minutes on weekdays that we were allowed to play and like an hour on the weekends. Gaming wasn't that big really for us. It was a time to kind of bond as brothers, but we spent more time playing outside. We spent more time out in the neighborhood, running around with the other kids and really enjoying ourselves in that aspect. And gaming was just one of those things that, like, it was fun to sit around, especially on a rainy day, and do something that was like this whole other world where we weren't really using our imaginations, but we were kind of still in that, taking turns playing those games together. The 2000s was kind of similar. To 2000s, I played Splinter Cell, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, a lot of NCAA football and NASCAR games. I loved some of the early NASCAR and college football games. Obviously, some of those have gotten better with time, and some have gotten worse in one way or another. San Andreas, Grand Theft Auto, I didn't play that until I was out on my own by the time I got the chance to actually play some of these games on my, so the nostalgia of playing with my brothers and stuff like that changes with that. But Splinter Cell Chaos Theory in particular was one that I remember very, very vividly. My brothers and I would sit around, we would play split screen because they had split screen multiplayer, cooperative play. And we would sit there and we would play together and make up roles for each of the characters and have fun, like taking out the guards and hiding the bodies. And we had a goal sometimes that we would take out the guards and then bring all of them back to like a centralized location. So we had all of the guards piled up in one place. And then often we would even go as far as like killing all but one of them and just knocking one of them out and leaving him with the other bodies, pretending like, oh, he'll wake up and he'll be like, what happened? Why am I the only one alive? And he would go to jail for it all. It was those kind of fun moments that really stick out to me when it comes to gaming, whether it's the 90s or the 2000s. Is that time spent with playing with my brothers and hanging out and that kind of thing. And that changed for me later on in life because my family's kind of grown apart. I don't spend as much time I don't really talk to my brothers hardly at all anymore. Like it's kind of become scattered. And in the 2010s, I started playing games like The Walking Dead, Grand Theft Auto 5, Red Dead Redemption 2, Skyrim, Fallout 4, and I started playing American Truck Simulator. And to me, that's where I think I started morphing a little bit, because I've never been a gamer. I've talked about that in other videos, where when you think of the classic gamer, you think of somebody that played that's like really deep into the games and the lore, and maybe they play like a whole bunch of indie games. They're constantly trying new games out. My son is a gamer. We've got him like Xbox Game Pass because he likes to like switch out games and play different things all the time, and he plays with his friends constantly. He's really deep into the lore. He knows all the mechanics. Like, that's what you think of when you think of gamer. For me, I was never a gamer. Gaming was a pastime. It was just something to do as a hobby. Now with this channel, it's become kind of a little bit more of a job in a way. I still enjoy it. It's not like a bad thing, but it's still just kind of a hobby for me. I don't get into the lore. I don't really care about the backstories of the characters and that kind of stuff for the most part, outside of talking about things like the Friend or Foe series. So for me, I was never really considered myself a gamer. So games like American Truck Simulator were one that I got into because I could just sit down and chill and listen to a book on Audible, or just kind of relax, put some YouTube up in the background or whatever, and just mindlessly drive a truck, right? And that was fun for me. A game like The Walking Dead, which I've talked about at length on this channel, I get the nostalgia of like playing it when it came out, and it was fun because I was loving The Walking Dead at the time. It was a big deal. It was a big series. But again, it's more of just a game that was kind of a pastime. I loved the story, and it was interesting. GTA 5 came out in the 2010s as well. And I know a lot of people like, well, it's Grand Theft Auto 5. You're just blowing things up. There's nothing. I loved the story of GTA 5. I loved the characters of GTA 5. For me, especially as I grew older, it became more about the stories in the game. It became more about the detail of the worlds. And that's why a game like Red Dead Redemption 2 sticks out, because that world is just so detailed and it's so fun to go through the characters, the people. It feels alive. You know, it's more of you slow down when you play a game like that. And while that might be technically better graphically, story wise than some of the games that came out in the 90s, even Red Dead Redemption 2 or a game like Skyrim or Fallout 4, which were both also story driven kind of narratives, they, even with better graphics, even with maybe more deep stories, they don't necessarily stand out for me as being better than what I played in the 90s. Which sounds kind of crazy, right, on the surface, because if the graphics are better, if the story is better, shouldn't it be better? Wouldn't that make the decade better overall? And then getting into the 2020s, I've realized I haven't played a ton of new releases. I've never really been hyped for new releases. There's been games that have come out in the past 6 years since 2020. Some big games, you know, Cyberpunk, Anthem, The Last of Us Part 1 and 2, technically, Hogwarts Legacy, which I did play. I've got on my list. Valheim I played. But there's been some huge games that I haven't even touched. Cyberpunk's one that I'm going to be covering in the Philosophy and Ethics series, but that I just didn't care for. And it got me thinking, like, okay, well, maybe that's because I'm not a gamer. Is it because the games are getting worse? I've heard that argument made, that games are getting worse overall, that they just aren't as fun as they used to be. They're overly monetized. You know, when I talked about like playing college football and NASCAR games, a lot of the newer sports games even are just so heavily monetized. My son and I like to play college football and Madden together. We've got franchises that we'll play. And every time I load up Madden, especially, but even college football, the first thing it does is, hey, come play Ultimate Team. Come buy a card packs, or work your way into them. You know, it's pay as you go type of thing. It's just more and more monetized. Even games that you wouldn't expect really push the monetization. Red Dead Redemption 2, as great as the offline is, really pushes the online stuff. They really want you to. It's died off because they didn't really make as much money as they expected, but you can still play online. You can still buy gold, and they expect you to buy those things. They overprice everything in the store so while you can earn some gold, it's just quicker and easier to buy it. You know, you'll never get anywhere if you don't pay real world money for things. Grand Theft Auto 5 was probably the first big one that did that and really took off with the monetization and the shark cards and stuff. And so maybe that's what makes it feel like it's not as good nowadays as it used to be. The over monetization, the over online type of stuff. I've never been a real social person, so I didn't really care about the social aspect for the most part. You know, I enjoyed playing the games with my brothers, but I never really cared about playing online with other people. I, in fact, hated playing online. And I've got a whole video plan to talk about online gaming and that kind of stuff, but it was just never a thing that I cared much about. So what exactly would make one decade better gaming better than another? And what it comes down to is something I mentioned a little bit ago. I said the word nostalgia. And basically, if you grew up in the 2010s, you're probably sitting there saying, well, the games in the 2010s were clearly the best games of all time. I played for hours with my friends in Minecraft or Red Dead Redemption or GTA 5 Online. You know, I played with my friends on all these games, or we would hang out, we would have game nights, and you know, if you grew up in the 2000s, you might say the same thing about games like Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, and that was the best decade, clearly, because the games were great, and I used to spend hours and hours of my youth playing these games. But really, it's nostalgia that makes that seem like such a great era. You know, it's the same reason why I feel at times like the 90s were the best decade of all time, right? I hit the height of my adolescence in in the 90s. I became a teenager in the 90s. That was the time where everything seemed like it was where it should be in the world. The world was a great place, right? The 80s, for people who grew up in the 80s, would be the same way. And that's what I think it really boils down to when it comes to gaming in general. I've had people that have told me in the comments, like, well, you should play some newer games. Maybe your channel would be bigger if you played some of the newer games that have come out in the past couple of years instead of playing the games that came out in the 2010s. But in reality, that's not even the case, because the games in the 2010s, the people, my average demographic for my channel is somewhere between 18 and 34 years old, mostly males between 18 and 34. And a lot of those people would have hit their early adulthood or late teens in the 2010s, some in the 2000s. But if you notice, most of the games I cover are in the 2010s, and I get a lot more traction on some of those. Some of the newer games, maybe we'll see when I get to starting covering things like Cyberpunk, how those do. But I have a feeling that Cyberpunk won't do quite as well on my channel as something like The Walking Dead, because The Walking Dead was a big phenomenon at the time. It was a lot of my audience was right in those nostalgic type of years. They're starting to become nostalgic for those early 2010s when The Walking Dead was popular. And I find that rather interesting. I think if I had started by covering games in the 90s, I would probably have a lot of people around my age that would be watching my channel on a regular basis because they would be nostalgic for their childhood. And so what I'm curious about is to hear what you guys think is the best decade in gaming, and give it some thought and why you think that was the best decade in gaming. If you want to look at graphics, you could probably say the 2010s might have been the best decade in gaming, although some of the games in the 2020s have started to kind of even ramp that up and gotten a little bit better. Not many. I think we kind of peaked from a graphics standpoint for a lot of things. But if that's your primary driver, you probably lean more towards the 2010s, 2020s. If you're looking at story, if you're looking strictly at the best stories in gaming, well, you might be looking back at the 90s and thinking about some of the big RPG games like I was going to say Fallout, which Fallout was one, but the Elder Scrolls series that started coming out. Not Baldur's Gate. Baldur's Gate, I think, is a newer thing. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know a ton of role-playing games in the 90s, but there's a lot of story-based, very heavy story-based games in the 90s. So you might look at the 90s and say, well, that's where the bedrock of a lot of the great stories we see today came from. Even the Grand Theft Auto series started in the 90s, though it wasn't as story-rich as it became later on. But a lot of these great franchises we see today started in the 90s. So maybe the 90s is the best. Maybe you like the old school of playing around with gaming cabinets and the 80s or the 70s. Maybe you grew up in that time thinking, man, it was so much fun to get off of school and run down to the arcade with a pocket full of quarters and play with my friends, playing different games and seeing who can get the highest score. Maybe that was the best time. And you think, well, that was the greatest time ever in gaming. I think we can all agree that 1983 or so was really probably the worst time of ever for gaming because of E.T. but outside of that little blip, that you could be looking at sales and say, well, the best decade in gaming, let's base it on sales. Maybe not overall money, because the dollar amount's going to go up thanks to inflation, but maybe let's look at just like a metric of total sales of units of games or something like, you could look at a million different metrics. What metric would you look at? For me, I think it's probably nostalgia for most people. Most people look at it and they say, this was the time that I enjoyed the most. This was the time that I loved playing games the most, that I had the most fun, that I remember most fondly. And that's the greatest decade of gaming. And for me, that's easily the 90s, the late 90s, early 2000s specifically. Because of what I said before, sitting down on a Friday night or Saturday night, playing games with my brothers and just hanging out and having a good time. And it was back before like the world kind of became this horrible, what it's become today. It's become quite an interesting place in the past few years, especially. But it's that time that in my mind I go back to and think that was a great time. I wish we could go back to that, even though technically I wouldn't want to for other reasons. But like, that's where I'm at. That's what I'm thinking. But I want to hear what you guys have to say about that. What do you think the best decade in gaming was, and why? That's very important. Why do you think it was the best decade in gaming? Because I don't think there's any objective standard. Even nostalgia is not an objective standard, because nostalgia is going to be different for everybody. If you didn't play games growing up and only got into them as an adult, you're going to have a different feeling about it than I do. So do you think there's even possible to have an objective standard for the best decade in gaming? Let me know in the comments below. But I think that's really all I wanted to cover for this video. It's just a topic that's been on my mind, and I want to do more of these where I'm talking more generally about things and just random stuff, because there's so many other things out there than just the stories and games. And I want these videos to be like just a chat, just hanging out, just bringing up topics that you guys might find interesting, that I find interesting, and just going from there. But I want to thank you all for watching. You can join the Patreon. I should have put it up here at some point. You can join the Patreon over here if you want to help the channel out. Subscribe if you aren't already subscribed. I'm always trying to grow, trying to eventually make something of this channel down the road. But thank you all for watching. Everybody have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next one.